welcome to this special edition where we analyze the performance of the Modi government over the past 4 years on the macroeconomic parameters and on macroeconomic policies. Well, first up, GDP growth. If you looked at the past 4 years, on an average, the government has been able to keep GDP growth at between 7.3 and 7.4%, which is, you can say, a signal achievement. Whether you looked at GVA or GDP, the performance has been very significant. But is this entirely because of the government's own effort, or has it been a beneficiary of global growth? Has it not taken advantage of global growth enough and pushed the growth even further? Let's come to inflation. Again, a very signal achievement. Since FY15, inflation has not gone above 5%, largely been below that figure. May start rising now by the end of this year. Is this an achievement of the government alone? Of course, crude has been a very, very big help, going down to as low as $30. But to the credit of this government is the Monetary Policy Framework and the Monetary Policy Committee, which has been tasked with keeping inflation at 4% plus or minus 2%. And probably this is a good safeguard to keep inflation lower even when crude rises towards $100. That's definitely an achievement of the government. Current account deficit trend, again, a very good set of numbers. Starting from FY14, the current account deficit has not gone above 2%, but it is in danger of going to 2.6% in the final year, that is FY19. Again, this achievement probably owes more to lower crude prices. Once crude prices rise, again, current account deficit may jump to 2.6%. Maybe a negative for the government would be that exports have not grown to the extent that global recovery should have taken the exports to, and that perhaps is a negative of the government of the last 4 years. Finally, let's come to the fiscal deficit. There again, achievement is very good, considering that the previous 2 years, FY13 and 14, we were running at a 4.9 and 4.5. Fiscal deficit has come down well below 4% and stands at 3.5%. The negative could be it has not gone below 3.5%. The positive also is there in the tax to GDP ratio, which have risen from 10.5% all the way to 11.2 and 11.6%. But again, how much of this is because of the government's own effort? Largely, the government is lucky that crude prices are lower, and it has been able to impose a high fuel excise, which has contributed almost 2 lakh crores in the past 2 years, helping to bring up the tax to GDP ratio. Minus that, maybe both fiscal deficit and tax to GDP would have been very difficult to achieve. However, a signal achievement of the government is the 23% growth in personal income tax, which is a big plus, but we have to see whether the government will be able to sustain it. Well, with this macroeconomic report card, let us now invite our experts. We are going to be joined by Dr. C. Rangarajan later on in the show. But first up, joining me to discuss the macroeconomic achievements of the government are two able economists, Dr. Rathin Roy, who is member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and, of course, a leading economist, and Jahangir Aziz, the chief economist from JPMorgan. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. Well, first up, before I come to growth and inflation, would you say fiscal deficit is definitely an achievement of the government? Also because, as we just saw, the tax to GDP ratio has risen. Right. Is this an achievement, a sustainable one, or is it ephemeral and only because of crude?
Right. So I think there's good points and bad points with this thing. So obviously the central government fiscal deficit was reduced from 4.1 to 3.3. One would have expected it to have a faster rate of consolidation. But if you look at centre plus state together, there hasn't really been any material consolidation over the last 3-4 years. It's sort of bounded at 6.5%, 7%, and this is despite oil coming off the boil at from 125 right down to 25 and then slowly creeping up. So I would say that it's a mixed card. The central government has done some fiscal consolidation, but overall fiscal consolidation has been far from what should have been the case, particularly given the fact that we've had such a huge windfall gain coming out from lower oil prices, at least in the better part of the last 4 years. Okay.
Dr. Roy, looking at it from another angle, the tax to GDP ratio has risen to 11.6%. Again, I'll have to put on the table the fact that at least 2 lakh crores over the last 2 years on an average has come because of fuel excise. Nevertheless, 11.6% tax to GDP from a low of what, 10.5% in the previous 4-5 years.
Yes.
Wouldn't you say it's a significant achievement, a sustainable one?
I think it's definitely sustainable because it could have been much higher. We've had this increase in the face of reasonably stringent policies net of indirect taxes. We've had this, except in the last year. We've had this in a period when growth has both been lower than expected and reasonably volatile. We've had this in a period when there's been some cleaning up and tax reform that's happened across the tax space and which would normally detract from buoyancy. So there's been a modest increase in buoyancy, and therefore I think it is sustainable. The key to looking forward is what you make of what will happen to GST in terms of improving the overall buoyancy of the economy. Obviously the recent increase in the number of taxpayers, however small their contribution to the tax base, by increasing the tax base sets the stage for a significant jump in buoyancy in future if complementary policies are kept okay.
Okay. Well, actually, on that note, personal income tax has grown by 23% in FY18. I would think if you go by nominal GDP, maybe a 10-15% growth would be. The remaining excess of another 10% over and above the normal, would you say that's an achievement because of demonetization? More people are in the tax bracket. Is that sustainable, you think?
Again, again, as Rathin was saying, I think some of it obviously is attributable to the government's efforts in increasing the tax base, whether it is because of demonetization or just efforts by the income tax expansion of income tax. So that's without going.
So that's an A for being able to expand.
Being able to expand the tax base obviously is an achievement, and I think that if you look at much of that income tax increase, significant portion of that is coming from corporate side. So I think we are in the right track in terms of getting around handling the 2 big problems that we always had, which is increasing the tax base and the tax buoyancy. The question again is the question of timing and whether or not we will be able to actually put in place other complementary tax policy changes such that we can capitalize on that or just let this go to waste. So I think that's clearly where I think the concerns are, that are we going to see actual simplification of the direct tax code?
Okay. Yeah, that is still to come. But this 23% growth in personal income tax, is that sustainable, you think, Dr. Roy? That would be an achievement because it could be because of demonetization.
No, I mean, obviously as the importance of income tax, personal income tax rises, and as Jahangir said, I can't comment on whether it's due to a replacement of one set of banknotes but other set of banknotes. That may be one factor in improving the tax base. There's been a lot of work being done on this in the Revenue Department, I know, for a number of years. But obviously as the base goes up, the rate of growth will not be at 23%.
Okay.
But what we are looking for here is steady above GDP rises of in personal income tax take. Let's say that since personal income tax is a function of income, if income rises nominally by about 11%, I'll be happy with personal income tax rises of anything above 15%. Okay. So is 15% and above sustainable for the next 5-6 years? I think it certainly is.
Okay. Well, let me come to the inflation control measures that the government has taken. Putting in a monetary policy framework, setting up of a monetary policy committee with independent external members, largely independent, you will have to say, from the working. And therefore, even if inflation now is down, probably because of demonetization and crude prices, have we put in a good institution that will control inflationary spirals in the future? Is that an achievement of the government?
I mean, moving to a monetary policy committee or moving to an inflation targeting framework is probably to me, from a macro point of view, the biggest achievement of this government. I would place every other achievement in the macroeconomic sphere secondary to that. I think this was what was wanting in India's monetary policy for many, many years. And I think saying that we are at the stage where, the beginning stage of seeing how this inflation targeting framework gets implemented. We haven't really been tested. So whether or not it is obviously clearly an achievement, whether or not this is going to hold good in a rising inflation environment, that we have to see.
Banking, Dr. Roy, the Bank Board Bureau, the Indradhanush, all that don't seem to have really helped in changing governance structures in the banking system. Would that be a disappointment?
No, because I didn't think that the Bank Board's Bureau would be necessary to have a more professional sort of way in which you appoint chief executives of banks and financial institutions. And to that extent, I think the attempt to set in place such an apparatus, even if only partially successful, is a laudable one. But it's not sufficient. There's much more you need to do to improve the governance of a bunch of banks that are owned by government, regulated by a central bank and by the government, quite how I don't know, compatibly, and which are then subject, therefore, to a number of public policy pressures on which their ability to take decisions is not autonomous. We also have to worry about how bankers are recruited. I don't think there's any other country in the world where bankers are recruited on the basis of a mass competitive exam. And then essentially it's a closed shop till you get to senior management, where you swap around bankers between public sector banks. Obviously, your ability to inculcate banking skills in these circumstances is going to be random. The
government came with a great majority. It does not have the legacy of being the one that started bank nationalization. With that political and ideological tailwind going for it, did it not use the opportunity to reimagine public sector banks, maybe privatize them, maybe bring in better governance within the setup? Is this an opportunity lost? Would you give the government an A+ or an A- on this?
I would say that this is one of the places where we have been very disappointed with what the government has done. So if you go back to 2014, when the government came to power, I think we wrote this piece about what are the binding constraints to growth, saying that, look, the politics has changed, but the economic reality hasn't changed. And the number one was the non-performing loans in the banking system. So it isn't that I'm saying this, with 20/20 hindsight. And, that has been an issue. It took about 3 years for the government to recognize the problem and then put in place mechanisms which are going to take much longer time. And in the meanwhile, this banking sector issue is going to continue to fester. And I'm
going to stop you because I think Rathin Roy has explained this brilliantly, that you can't run this banking system with open exams and then pretty much lock it up. It's serious HR issues. We have to wind up now. Dr. Roy, your final comment on this government's achievements in terms of macro parameters as well as macro institutions, GST Council, MPC, IBC. How would you rate it? An A, a B? What would you rate it? How would you rate it?
It's been a very active government. It's been a very active government in terms of its engagement with the macroeconomy. It's had a good run in terms of reasonable global stability, including but not confined to oil prices. It has shown the willingness to confront difficult issues and complete and finish on important institutional reforms like the IBC and the Monetary Policy Committee. And if you look at the macroeconomic outcomes, they could have been much worse. Growth has been reasonably high, maybe not as high as people like to dream and imagine, but dreaming doesn't get you things, but things would have been much worse. Growth could have been at 5% or 6%. The exchange rate has been reasonably well managed. I think central banks and Government of India relations have been reasonably well coordinated to make sure that monetary policy delivers, inflation that is broadly within the inflation target band. And this has, I think, set a very good base for the kind of reforms that Jahangir and I both want to see, which will not just incrementally, but transformationally alter the potential of the Indian economy to grow in a stable fashion going forward, which is the core job of macroeconomics.
You two get 1 minute.
So I will disagree a bit. I will disagree a bit with Rathin in the sense that I acknowledge that all of these reforms have been done. The macroeconomic side has been active, and they have actively managed it. But setting all of those sides, if I just look at growth and growth evolution in India over the last 4 or 5 years, and I use one variable called oil prices, I more or less explain about 90% of the growth variation. When oil prices fell from 125.25, India grew. Whereas oil prices started to rise from first quarter of 2016, that's when the growth slowdown was taking place. We can blame demonetization and GST as much as possible, but the growth slowdown in India took place exactly when oil prices started to rise. And the continued dependency on oil prices as a driver of growth, that suggests that the vulnerability of the Indian economy to exogenous forces, we still have ways to go before we can actually say that the battle has been won.
Okay, I'll take the luxury of editorializing. Rathin gives a lot of credit to the government and says that they've also been lucky because of global factors. Jahangir thinks that global factors have been more responsible and the government has been more lucky than efficient, but both agree that the government has achieved a lot in terms of institutional setup. Thank you very much, Rathin Roy and Jahangir, for joining me in this analysis of the 4-year report card of the government with respect to macroeconomic parameters. We have to take a break, but thereafter we are going to be joined by Dr. Rangarajan, another stalwart, to analyze the 4-year track record.